couple of weeks ago, I shot a gig with my Fuji x100 and I used some slow shutter speeds and some flash, and I was really happy with how the photos came out. So today I thought I would make a video explaining exactly how I did it. Before we get started, I just want to make it clear that even though I used my x100, this can be done with almost any camera. All you need is to be able to control the shutter speed, and it needs to have a flash. Or if it doesn't have a flash, you need to have an external flash like this one. My personal setup was my x100v. I had the Fuji wide conversion lens on the front, and I had this Lightpix Labs Flash Q Q22, which is a stupidly long name for a flash. It should just be called Flash Q. Anyway, this is a little flash that you put on top of the camera. You press a button on the back and it disconnects the bottom part of the flash so that you can use the main part of the flash anywhere you want. You just hold it in your other hand, so it's pretty handy. But if you don't have a flash like this, you can use an on-camera flash or even the built-in flash, like the one that is on the Fuji x100. The main idea of these photos is that you take the photo and the flash will fire and it will freeze the movement, but then the shutter of the camera will stay open for a little while longer so that you can get these pretty cool light trails in your image. I've found that this works great, especially at gigs, but really you can apply this method to almost any style of photography. You can do portraits with it, you can shoot sports with it. Ideally, if you've got some movement in your subject, that is great, but if not, we can make movement with the camera anyway. So first things first, what we want to do, we want to put our flash on top of our camera. If you are using a flash with the Fujifilm camera, you have to make sure that the built-in flash is turned off in the flash settings, and then you need to go to flash function setting at the top, and you need to make sure your sync terminal is set to M. Or if you are using the built-in flash with the camera, you want to turn this on. Next up, we want to choose a shutter speed that is slightly slower than what we would normally use. Now this is mainly trial and error, and it will depend on what environment you're shooting in and how much movement specifically you want to get in your shots. The slower your shutter speed, the more movement will be in your shots. And the faster your shutter speed, you will only get little tiny light trails or maybe even just little blurs of light around your subject. For the majority of these photos, I used 1/4 of a second. I also had my ISO value set to about 1000. And my aperture was somewhere around f4 to f5.6. Now, as you can probably see in this room right now, the image is pretty overexposed with these settings. When I took these photos, I was in a dark room, so you will have to adjust your settings accordingly for your environment. But what you want to do is you want to keep your shutter speed at around about 1/4 of a second, and you want to adjust your ISO and your aperture so that the image on the back of your screen is pretty dark. So now you can see that the image on the back of my screen is very dark. However, we're going to brighten this up with a flash. Here is where we run into our main problem with mirrorless cameras, because by default, when you change a setting, it will change that setting on the back of the screen. And naturally, because we want to use flash with our camera, our photo is going to look pretty underexposed until the flash fires. So when we're looking at the back of the screen to try and frame our shots up, the shots are going to look dark. This is because setting effect is turned on, which shows a preview of how your photo will look with the current camera settings: ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. So what we need to do is we need to turn the setting effect off in the settings. On the x100v or other Fujifilm cameras, you want to go to the wrench menu, you want to go screen setup, and you want to go down to the second page, and there'll be an option called Preview EXP/WB in manual mode. What we want to do is we want to turn that setting off, and that means that the screen on the back of your camera will basically just show an overall decent exposure so that you can get your shots framed up and also still use flash. Next, we want to turn our flash on, and I would probably recommend turning your flash to a manual setting just so you have full control over it. So I'm going to put my flash to 1/16th power, and I'm going to give that a little bit of a lighting test. My photo on the back is too dark. I don't want to turn my flash up too much, because if it's firing on the highest setting, it just means that it's going to use more battery in my flash and it'll take longer in between charges. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to boost my ISO. Right now in this room I have it on 160, so I'm going to up that to ISO 1000, and I'm going to take another test shot. Okay, so as you can see, exposure wise, that's come out okay. It probably looks overexposed on that screen there, but it looks pretty decent on the back of the camera. So now we have our flash pretty much set up to a good exposure. If it's too bright or too dark, we can adjust either our aperture or our ISO to adjust the exposure. And now for the technique of how we get these light trails in the camera. So I can either leave the flash on the camera or I can take it off, which is how I was shooting at the gig. Basically what I was doing, I was putting the camera to my eye like that so I can frame up my shots, or I was using the screen on the back, and then I was holding the flash around about here. How we actually get the movement in the shot is what we need to do. We need to point it at our subject, get it in focus, and then as we take the shot, move the camera either to the side, up or down, or give it a little bit of a twist. So as you can see, twisting the camera like that is giving these weird light trails, which in this room doesn't really look too good. But if you were shooting in an environment like a gig, where you have, for example, a guitarist, and then behind them they have spotlights shining on them, it makes these pretty cool light trails. So the technique is to basically press the button, and as you're pressing the button, just twist the camera or throw it off to one side. You can move it up, you can move it to the side. This will work the same no matter if you've got your flash in your hand, whether your flash is on top of the camera, or whether you are using the built-in flash in the camera. As long as your shutter speed is something quite slow, like half a second, a quarter of a second, or even 1 second, you're going to end up with these light trails. And that's kind of all there is to it. A lot of it is just experimenting. If you do it and your photo is too bright, maybe stop your aperture down to a bigger number, which will reduce the amount of light coming into your camera. Or alternatively, you can lower your ISO. If you do it and your photo is too dark, you can boost your ISO up to a higher number. If your flash is too bright, you can turn the flash down. So for example, right now, this flash is on 1/16th power. You can see there on the back that there's this little orange light that's showing what power the flash is on. If I press these buttons on the back, this boosts and reduces the power of the flash. I would say that because a lot of it is trial and error, don't be disheartened if you take a few shots and they don't come out great. Just experiment with different settings. The most important thing is that you are using flash and that you have a slow shutter speed. The only other variable in this is the sync mode. That's this little option here underneath where you set your flash on and off. On other cameras this might be called front curtain or rear curtain sync. And all this option does is decide whether you want the flash to fire at the beginning of your exposure or the end of your exposure. Now personally, I would have it set at the beginning, because if you're framing your shot up, and let's say you're framing up a guitarist on stage and you've got them where you want them, you press the shutter and then you move the camera, you're going to get a flash, and because the guitarist was where you wanted the first time, you're going to have the composition that you wanted. If you had it set to flash at the end of the exposure, you have to calculate where your camera is going to be at the end of the exposure, and it's a lot harder to compose shots this way. However, using rear sync means that you get a blur and then a flash. This would be really useful if you were taking photos, for example, of someone running, because you would get the flash at the end, which will freeze them at one side of the frame, and then you would get a blur of where they had already run. If you want that illusion of speed blur, you're going to need to use rear curtain sync. I edited these shots in Lightroom using a custom black and white preset that I'm going to be making available to people in the next couple of months, so definitely keep an eye out for that. But if you're more of a straight out of camera person, I would definitely recommend my black and white Fujifilm recipe, which is going to appear right here. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this has been helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.